Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Love on the Line by Anabelle Bryant. Narrated by Victoria Aston. 1. London, 1817. The glint of his knife caught her attention. Perched high above Vauxhall Gardens, balanced on a tightrope less than 2 inches wide, Lola York witnessed a murder. Captivated by the brutal act and unable to scream, she remained trapped between the surety of her steps and a death fall to the ground below. Usually, her nightly performances suspended her above the cruelties of reality. Walking the rope was the only time she felt completely safe and utterly free, as though she could finally breathe once she rose above London, unfettered by the sins of the past and uncertainty of her future. But now, halfway across, poised between 2 wooden stanchions, the unexpected flash of moonlight on metal drew her eyes to the violent scene as it unfolded on a shadowy path beyond the grandstand. Horrified and transfixed, she stayed motionless, while below, multitudes of gathered spectators and excitement-seekers waited breathlessly for her next step. Still, she couldn't move, not while 2 dark figures fought, one with malice, the other in defence. The attacker wore a long black greatcoat and came at the other person in a silent rush that took the victim unaware. There wasn't much else to see. It was over in the length of a few exhales. Someone in the stands yelled an obscenity, impatient with her immobility. She blinked several times in succession and fixed her eyes on the rope, moving forward with rote memory and unerring balance until she reached the other side. An oblivious burst of applause swelled upward into the air around her as she waved numbly to the blurred faces of the crowd. She was a mistress of grace and balance. Nothing was more important than the show. Shaken, she glanced over her shoulder, beyond the grandstand to the darkened path where she'd witnessed someone's life stolen in a matter of seconds. Now, only darkness met her eyes, aside from the slumped form of a body left behind. Pickpockets, swindlers, prostitutes and the like were common to Vauxhall. In fact, many visitors thrived on the danger and illicit juxtaposition the pleasure gardens offered. But murder was unsettling. She had no time to reconcile her thoughts as the grandstand emptied, the show having ended. A heartbeat later, a high-pitched scream pierced the air. Several more followed. Male voices barked orders, crowds dispersed, others gathered along the path periphery, seeking a bit of morbid gawking. The shrill whistle of the watch sounded. On that isolated path, things were becoming known. Far above the chaos, Lola waited on the wooden platform. "Lola!" She recognized Marco's voice and glanced to the rope ladder dangling over the side of the platform and down to the ground. Marco de Leon was a fellow performer and a good friend. He climbed halfway and paused when their eyes met. "Are you all right?" He began to climb higher, and she stalled him by holding up her flattened palm. Noticing how her fingers trembled, she dropped her hand just as quickly. "Yes, I'm fine." She wasn't ready to talk about what she'd seen, not even with Marco, the one person at Vauxhall who knew about her past, someone she'd grown close to and shared a brief relationship. Even though they'd separated over a year ago, he continued to be protective, and she didn't want to answer his questions or ignite his concern. The less she told him, the better it would be all around. "A man was killed." He'd reached the platform, having climbed up anyway. "Did you know?" "No," she lied and leaned over to adjust her slipper, avoiding his eyes. "Did you see it?" "I saw nothing," he answered. "I don't think anyone did." All eyes were on you, on the rope. Everyone else was busy performing or preparing. I was inside the pavilion. I only came out when I heard someone scream." "What have you learned?" She stepped toward the rope ladder, knowing he would have to descend so she could follow. "Not much," he spoke as he moved. "A man was stabbed. He's dead. But it hurts us all. The last thing we need is Bow Street nosing around here. It cuts into the profits." Marco didn't exaggerate. The more knobs and cits who sought respite from life's tedium by visiting the infamous pleasure grounds, the more money there was to be made. Crowds were important. Size definitely mattered. Lola and the other performers were a misfit collection of outcasts and drifters who looked out for their own and shared a common dislike of runners and lawmen. The entertainers were loyal to each other and rarely asked questions, more interested in their present than another's history. Lola had come into her occupation on the tightrope by accident, but it suited this new version of her life. Perhaps it was only what she deserved. Past decisions were better left unexamined at the moment. And like Marco, everyone in employ at Vauxhall had secrets of their own to protect. Theodore Michael Coventry, 3rd Earl of Essex, awoke to the sound of loud pounding. Fighting off the weight of interrupted sleep, he glanced at the clock on the mantel and startled to awareness. At this hour, who the hell knew he was in-house anyway? With a breath composed of annoyance and impatience, he left the comfort of his chair near the fire and answered the door. Having only just returned to London the day before, he hadn't secured the staff needed for his townhouse in Mayfair. From what he could tell, little had changed in the city of his birth since he'd left 2 years ago to travel abroad. Perhaps he hadn't changed either. That same relentless restlessness in his blood persisted, even now at midnight. It could be nothing more than exhaustion. Sleep often escaped him, and the deep slumber he'd experienced before the knocking began was ever elusive and rare. Drawing a cleansing breath, he lifted the latch and opened the door. 2 men stood on the front steps. "We need to speak to the Earl of Essex," the taller man stated. "I am Essex," Theodore replied, chagrin overriding his earlier annoyance. It wasn't every day he was mistaken for the butler. "May we have a moment of your time, my lord?" This came from the shorter man. "We're from Bow Street. There's been an incident of which you should be informed." The latter remark ignited curiosity instead of concern. He was an only child with deceased parents and distant, if any, extended family. Having been away for over 2 years, he couldn't imagine what the runners sought at this ungodly hour. He angled the door wider in a gesture meant to invite the men in. Perhaps if he could dispose of the issue quickly, he'd have the chance to reclaim some much-needed sleep tonight. "What is this about?" Theodore asked as he led the runners into the front drawing-room. A modest fire still burned in the hearth, keeping his chair warm until he could return. He walked to the decanter atop the mahogany console table and gestured to the crystal glasses. "Brandy?" Both constables declined. "I'm Fredrickson, and this is Johns," the taller man said, indicating the other. "We're here on official business. Ordinarily, I would offer you tea and refreshments, but unfortunately I've just returned from travel in America. I haven't staffed the house yet." "Thank you, my lord, but that isn't necessary," Fredrickson continued. "There's been an incident, and we'd like to ask you a few questions in regard to the matter." "So then I'll need a brandy." Theodore turned, poured himself a drink, and took a hearty swallow. "Obviously there's more to the story. What happened, and what does it have to do with me?" "You returned yesterday?" Johns asked, glancing at the pad in his hand. Theodore wasn't aware the man had taken notes. "Yes, by way of the packet ship, Esmeralda. She docked 2 nights ago, and I've since arrived in London." "Are you acquainted with Stephen Blakeley, Viscount Fremont?" "Yes, why do you ask?" Theodore hoped his closest friend and ally hadn't found his way into trouble. Fremont was a devil-may-care type fellow who never failed to lighten the mood in a room with his entertaining antics. He was one of the few people Theodore trusted implicitly, having gone through university together and later maintained their relationship into adulthood. Despite Fremont's escapades, he possessed a heart of gold and unflappable character. They didn't share bloodlines, but in actuality the Viscount was the closest thing to a brother Theodore would ever have. He valued their friendship immeasurably and looked forward to seeing Fremont now that he'd returned to London. An unexpected smile accompanied that thought. "What has the wastrel done? Gotten foxed and waded bare-arsed into the St. James's fountain? Popped someone's cork over a pretty lady? Or has he raced his phaeton down Rotten Row? You must tell the buffoon I'll not pay his fines again." A formidable silence permeated the room. Theodore turned from where he'd grinned at the fire and met the solemn stare of both constables. "What's happened?" "We are sorry to inform you of Viscount Fremont's passing." For a moment, Theodore couldn't breathe. Had he misheard? "What are you talking about? Stephen is my age, only 29. He's not dead. You're mistaken." With regret, Fredrickson shifted his stance, his shoulders straightening with the movement. "It is not a mistake." Theodore downed the last of his brandy and set the glass on the mantel, anger quick to override all other emotion. "What happened? I've asked you 3 times. Tell me what happened." He paced across the room, wanting to separate himself from whatever the 2 officers meant to share, and at the same time needing to learn every detail. Fremont couldn't be dead. The son of a bitch was too full of life, had too much to live for. Something was very wrong here. "He was a victim of a crime at Vauxhall Gardens earlier this evening," John said plainly. "We're working to understand exactly what occurred. At this point, we know the Viscount was overtaken on one of the private paths. He was stabbed and killed. It may have been a simple robbery." "A simple robbery?" Theodore repeated the words as he strode across the room, not stopping until he stood within a pace of the 2 runners. His thunderous expression caused John's to take a step back. "There's nothing simple about this." "Of course not," Fredrickson was quick to amend, "but crime happens all the time at Vauxhall, and while we work to investigate crime, yes, stolen watches and illegal dice, not murder, not murder of a nobleman, not murder of my friend." His voice had grown louder with each statement until he'd shouted the last words. Drawing a deep breath, he waited, attempting to process the inconceivable idea Fremont was gone. Fremont was gone. "What do you know?" Theodore asked, impatience and rage coursing through him like repeated lightning strikes. "Tell me what you know." "My lord, we've come tonight because Viscount Fremont had a letter from you in his coat pocket." "Yes, I'd written it to him. About my return. We'd planned to meet once I was settled." Theodore shook his head, still rejecting the truth. There would be no meeting now. He'd never hear his friend's jovial laughter, never hear his voice again. "What have you learned about who did this? Stop wasting time. Shouldn't you be at Vauxhall questioning people?" "Unfortunately, our information is limited," Johns answered more delicately, nodding for his partner to continue. "By the time we arrived at Vauxhall, the visitors had already left. It appears the crime occurred while one of the entertainers performed her act. All eyes were on the tightrope. Most areas were busy with customers. Dinner boxes were full. The orchestra played for a large audience on the opposite side of the rotunda. The other main acts were already finished for the night, and the employees had returned to the large tent or gone home." Fredrickson paused in the retelling, visibly uncomfortable with whatever he would say next. "Lord Fremont was found on a darkened path behind the grandstand. It is a remote and deserted area, sometimes used for amorous assignations. We've spoken to Mr. Morland, the man in charge. Due to the loud music and typical goings-on, no one reported hearing anything untoward, mainly because a stabbing is silent in comparison to a gunshot. Considering the seclusion of the private paths, no one witnessed anything unusual. We have a plan to return tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to interview whoever was working at the time. Morland will arrange for all employees to be there. I will accompany you." Theodore stared at the officers. His heart had calmed enough now to ache with the pain of loss. "With all due respect, Lord Essex, we came here tonight to inform you of Viscount Fremont's passing and ask about your relationship. Nothing more," John said. "Any further involvement is not necessary. We'll—" "I said I will accompany you." It could have been the note of finality in his voice, or the dead seriousness of his stare, but both officers gave their agreement before Theodore promptly led them out. 2. Almost everyone was seated on the wooden benches inside the Turkish tent when Lola entered the next morning. Marco was quick to motion to the empty place beside him. She walked over slowly, skimming a glance over the makeshift family who'd adopted her since she'd found her way to Vauxhall 2 years ago. She greeted them with a slight smile. Pockets of murmured conversation continued, though concern was etched into everyone's expression, a stark contrast to the lively colours of the tent panels. Here, with these talented people, opera singers, acrobats, dancers and jugglers, she'd found acceptance. No one cared about the colour of one's skin, manner of speech, level of education or purse size. It was a cruel contradiction that by being born on the right side of the blanket, the upper 10,000 possessed all the betterments of society and yet rapaciously sought out the rare gifts of the people they regarded as beneath them. However, she was one of the guilty, willing to exchange the risk of falling to her death from an unimaginable height for the thrill of walking the rope in front of a crowd. The world she lived in rarely made sense. "Morland just entered," Marco said as she approached. "When I didn't see you here, I thought you forgot." How could she forget? She'd hardly slept last night. "I wasn't in a hurry," she answered, settling on the bench and making a process of smoothing her skirt where the hem brushed against her calves. She looked across the tent to where Morland waited. Word had spread that a few runners would question everyone this morning. "I almost came to get you. I wasn't sure." "You needn't worry about me, Marco. We're no longer together." She stared straight ahead, watching Morland as he ushered 3 men into the tent. "But we're still friends." "Yes, of course." She watched the first 2 men as they spoke with the Vauxhall manager, but the third stranger stood apart from the conversation. His attention remained on the benches where the performers had assembled. By comparison to the other officers, he was taller, broader. His hair was dark as pitch, while the other 2 men were less intimidating somehow, but not this man. He wore a long black greatcoat in kind to the attacker. Seeing it unnerved her. No matter that type of coat was likely the preferred uniform of better society. Still, something unexpected alerted her to this man's presence, and she didn't like the feeling. She watched as he slowly assessed everyone seated across the back of the tent, waiting for his focus to move to her section. Her pulse raced, as if by merely glancing in her direction he would be able to tell she'd witnessed the killing. Shaking her head to dismiss the idea, she dropped her gaze to her slippers. "The runners are here now," Marco muttered, seemingly just as uncomfortable as she. He indicated the men with a slight wag of his chin. She didn't answer, not wanting to look in that direction again. Instead, she concentrated on Marco's profile, outlined by the early light stealing through the gaps in the canvas panels. He hadn't shaved this morning. He looked tired. Perhaps he was more affected by the murder than he'd let on. Marco was a good man who, by being of mixed heritage, knew only injustice in his life. Dismissed by better society, he possessed finer qualities than many of the knobs who visited Vauxhall in search of drunkenness and debauchery. The current situation couldn't sit well with him either. A prickle of awareness skittered up her spine, and she bit into her lower lip, willing herself not to turn toward the runners. When they were ready, they would address the crowd. There was no need to create unnecessary eye contact, and yet Her pulse ramped up another notch, and her breathing grew stilted, unable to stay focused. She shifted her attention to the right, where her gaze collided with the dark-haired stranger. Their eyes held. The moment became unbearable. "Listen, everyone!" Morland approached, clapping his hands to gain the performer's attention, not unlike a schoolmaster demanding his students take notice. A bittersweet memory from her childhood resurrected the image, and she pushed it away as she brought her attention to the manager. "As you're already aware, a tragedy occurred here last night. A man was killed." A ripple of hushed conversation chased Morland's words across the tent until everyone quieted again. "Bow Street has sent 2 of their finest runners to speak with all of you in case anyone has seen or heard something unusual. Please give the officers your full cooperation. Remember, gossip about crime and heinous activity will keep visitors away. It's bad for business. I expect everyone to continue on as if nothing happened. Later tonight, things will proceed as always, but for now, do your best to tell the officers everything you can recall from last night." Without further comment, Morland stepped aside, and the 2 men Lola had already assumed were runners walked to the forefront. The older man, the one with the disturbing presence, lingered in the background, his eyes examining all of them as if specimens under glass. Marco must have noticed as well. He reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the bench, but she was too agitated to accept his comfort. She slipped her hand free and leaned down to adjust her slippers, keeping her fingers busy. When she glanced up again, the dark-haired gentleman had moved to the area directly across from the bench where she was seated. His penetrating gaze caused her heart to pound, yet unwilling to appear skittish, she didn't immediately look away. He had sharp, chiselled features, similar to the marble statues near the garden's entry gate. By Morland's description, this man was not a runner. Who was he then? She took in his expensive clothing, polished leather boots, and arrogant stance. Was he a superior sent to oversee the investigation? Belatedly, she noticed the black mourning band wrapped around his sleeve where it blended into the wool. So, he was a relation to the man who was killed. Since when did runners involve family members in their work? Bloody knobs with their superior entitlement always got their way. She raised her eyes to his face and found he watched her as well. She averted her gaze, not wanting to invite further interest. Theodore didn't know what to think of the collection of performers before him. He'd come to Vauxhall years ago and taken in a few shows, but to see so many unusual people assembled in one place when his mind spun with questions and heart ached with loss was almost too much to comprehend. He scanned the group, searching for something, any indication that seemed unnatural, but there was the rub. These performers thrived on the unnatural. They purposefully enhanced any quality considered untraditional, whether in their physical features, manner of dress, or eccentric skill. It was their trade, yet it made his task that much harder. So many of them gawked at him, as if he was the oddity. Others ignored him altogether. It was a peculiar situation. Continuing his perusal, he noticed a young woman at the far right side of the tent. She looked startled, for lack of a better description, as if she held her breath in wait. He'd observed how the man beside her had reached for her hand, and she'd pulled it away abruptly. That man appeared equally troubled. He too was young and from another country, if the colour of his skin was any indication. Although the audience before him consisted of every imaginable skin tone, life at Vauxhall couldn't be more different from the world where Theodore lived, not in appearances or the strict decorum of the earldom. He brought his attention back to the woman at the same time she chose to glance in his direction. Their eyes met and held. An unexpected frisson of emotion coursed through him. Did he know her? That was an impossibility, and yet something in her gaze felt familiar, as if they were connected somehow. His brow creased with the inane thought, though he didn't look away. She was beautiful, with delicate features and large, luminous eyes. Her dark, glossy hair fell nearly to her waist, and the image was intimate for its evocative invitation. Ladies of the ton kept their hair pinned back, hidden under bonnets or braided into intricate designs. Unseen, he inhaled deeply, ignoring a misplaced pulse of lust. Why hadn't she looked away? Did she feel the same invisible bond? The very idea was ludicrous. She likely challenged everyone in the same manner. Life in this atmosphere couldn't be easy. When she suddenly turned away, he felt the loss of her attention and mentally cursed himself. His emotions were erratic, running high as he came to grips with Fremont's passing. Regardless of the early hour, he needed a drink, probably more than one. "Thank you for coming in early to meet with us," Fredrickson addressed the performers, his back to Theodore, "so that we can gather information in an orderly manner. Johns and I will speak to each of you individually, and that may take some time. You are free to leave the tent briefly if absolutely necessary, although I ask that you return within the hour. Mr. Morland has supplied us with a list of employees, so failure to appear will cast you in an unfavourable light." Theodore was impressed. Fredrickson knew how to enhance his preamble with subtle threats aimed to get exactly what he wanted: compliance. "If anyone was near the pleasure paths behind the grandstand area, your information could be especially helpful in apprehending the attacker," Fredrickson went on. "Anything unusual or suspicious should be shared." "And it doesn't only have to be the events you observed last evening," Johns interjected. "The assailant may have visited repeatedly, waiting for the right opportunity. Any instance or strange happening that seems odd, uncommon, or inappropriate should be reported." A loud snicker from the left side of the tent overrode the end of John's sentence. "You'll be here to next Tuesday, if you want us to tell you all that," a male voice called out. Fredrickson began to organise the interview area, and Theodore glanced to where the young woman with the beguiling eyes was seated, but her half of the bench was empty now. He turned toward the exit at the rear of the tent in time to see her leave through the flap. Without a moment's hesitation, he set out after her. Lola's heartbeat hammered so loudly in her chest, she wondered if it would be the death of her. She wanted to visit the spot where she'd witnessed the murder, and then she'd return. Everyone was back at the tent. Now seemed a good time to slip away. Besides, if someone questioned her actions, she would claim curiosity, a desire to see the area in case it jarred a memory. Something like that. She didn't think more on it. Hurrying, she rounded the back of the grandstand and walked toward the maze of hedgerows and flowering shrubs that composed the pleasure paths. In the bright morning sun, the gardens looked welcoming and innocuous, but in her time at Vauxhall, all sorts of erotic acts and scandalous debauchery were reported to have happened within. Once inside, one could be assured of privacy. Even in daylight, it was easy to become lost in the labyrinth of green shrubbery lined with identical lanterns. She'd experienced it herself the few times she'd allowed Marco to take her inside. Now she swallowed her indecision, glanced cautiously over her shoulder and entered through the gate. Unless one had been inside the close walks at the exact time of the murder, or accidentally happened upon it, the act would have gone unseen. When she'd looked back a moment ago, the wooden stanchions and taut rope where she performed each evening rose high above the tent. The knowledge she might be the only person who'd witnessed the killing pressed on her chest. She could never confess such a thing, not with her past, not at the risk of discovery. Besides, she'd seen nothing more than a man in a long black coat. It was hardly a useful description. She pressed her eyes closed, not wanting to relive the experience, though the memory showed itself nonetheless. Several minutes later, she reached the area she sought. With tentative steps, she approached the small clearing and crouched down, running her fingertips over a patch of blood-stained dirt and crushed gravel. What had happened? Why was a man killed in a place meant for amorous acts and titillating entertainment? Had he been lured here purposefully, or was he waiting for a loved one? Too many questions.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?